Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's so nice to see some familiar faces. I really appreciate everyone taking the time to join us today. And big thank you to Manon, Lori, Melanie, and Isan for inviting me to talk about my research. So I'll be giving my talk in English, but you're welcome to pose questions in either French or English afterward, and I'll do my best to answer. And so like Melanie said, I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at McGill, but I'm joining you today from Toronto, which has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. It's now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. I'm beginning with this acknowledgement, not only as a way of signaling my commitment to decolonization and my responsibilities according to this covenant, but also to ground this conversation about campus sexual violence. So as Sarah Hunt explains, there's an urgent need to disrupt the logic that the legacy of sexual violence originating in colonial processes and policies is only felt intergenerationally within Indigenous communities at an imagined distance from the university. This imagined distance not only erases the experiences of Indigenous students, faculty, and staff, but also produces the university as a neutral space, separate from the community, and thus obscures its relationship to colonialism and location on what is often unceded territory. So in this sense, our efforts to eradicate campus sexual violence must grapple with this relationship and address the intersections of this violence with settler colonialism. I also want to note here before diving into my presentation that I recognize that the topics that I'm discussing today are very difficult, and I invite you to do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself, during the presentation and afterwards. So if you need to drop off the call, that's absolutely fine. So I'll begin sharing my screen. Okay, and just a note that I can't see the chat right now while I'm screen sharing, but I will look at all your comments or questions at the end of the presentation. Okay, so I've been researching gendered and sexualized violence for the past decade or so. And broadly speaking, my research interrogates how the ways that we understand violence shapes our prevention efforts and responses and our visions of justice. So shortly after I returned to Dalhousie University, following my master's field work on men's anti-violence efforts in South Africa, the Faculty of Dentistry scandal unfolded there. And as I'm sure some of you remember, a whistleblower exposed the contents of a private Facebook group for male dentistry students, which included a poll ranking their female classmates and jokes about subduing women with chloroform for the purpose of assaulting them. In the days that followed, revelations emerged about the larger culture of misogyny, homophobia, and racism within the faculty. I'm not singling Dalhousie out here because it was somehow unique or worse than other universities. What happened at Dalhousie was part of a series of highly publicized incidents of sexual violence on Canadian campuses that led to widespread demands for change, rather. I'm referencing Dalhousie due to its impact on my research trajectory. So because at least on most days, I'm inclined to agree with the sign in this photo that we are in a distinct cultural moment in which real change is possible, efforts to address campus sexual violence quickly became the focus of my research. So at a high level, some of the questions that animate my research include: what lessons can be drawn from decades of student activism and feminist thinking around violence to inform our understanding of this present moment? How can our anti-violence efforts avoid exacerbating the siloing of social justice movements and reification of sexual violence? Can justice heal? And what are the possibilities and constraints of practicing transformative or healing justice in the campus context? What does it mean to try to engage men in gender transformative anti-violence initiatives in the context of rising anti-feminist and alt-right backlash? What is it about the university that has made it the site of broader struggles over the power to define and delimit violence, justice, and free speech? So it's beyond the scope of my talk today, clearly, to even begin to answer all of these larger questions, but I think they signal what is at stake in this research. So today I want to focus specifically on my current project, which examines the backlash and resistance that anti-violence activists and practitioners at Canadian universities experience. And I'll begin by briefly outlining the context for this research and unpacking the concept of anti-feminist backlash. I'll then discuss how this backlash shows up on campus and its impacts on activists and practitioners and their anti-violence work. And I'll conclude my talk with a brief discussion of some of the ways that activists respond to or resist this backlash. So, of course, as we know, campus sexual violence is not a new phenomenon. In fact, research shows that prevalence rates have remained static over the past several decades in Canada. Ahistoric representations that suggest that it's a new issue or an epidemic obscure its roots in structures of power that are deeply embedded within our post-secondary institutions. These representations also mask the histories of student anti-violence activism, despite their relevance in contemporary debates. At the same time, though, post-secondary institutions across North America, the United Kingdom, and beyond have recently faced unprecedented pressure to respond to sexual violence on campus. So as I alluded to earlier, ongoing student activism and heightened public and mainstream media attention have contributed to this pressure in Canada. Events of this fall, including the mass demonstration at Western, which is pictured here, in response to social media reports that up to 30 students were drugged and assaulted, have only added to this pressure. During the same time period, several Canadian provinces, including Ontario and Quebec, have introduced legislation requiring post-secondary institutions to develop standalone sexual violence policies and reporting processes. And in 2018, the federal government committed $5.5 million over 5 years to create a harmonized national framework to address campus sexual violence. So in the current context, there's widespread acknowledgement that sexual violence is a problem at universities, but I would suggest that it's rarely recognized as a problem of the university. And so by that, I mean that if sexual violence is an issue of power rather than of sex, it can't be understood outside of the institutionally embedded inequities that produce and sustain it. And to be clear, I'm not only talking about gendered inequities here. My understanding of sexual violence is grounded in an intersectional analysis that recognizes the harm that can come from treating it as separate or separable from racism, colonialism, sexism, and other forms of violence. I'm also conscious of the ways in which recent momentum toward addressing sexual violence on campus may exacerbate the siloing of social justice movements. And as I highlighted at the beginning of my talk, can reproduce harm and marginalization when it doesn't account for these intersections. So it follows then that eradicating violence on our campuses requires transformation of these deeply embedded institutional power relations. Throughout my research, I've been interested in the actors and mechanisms that might shape the constraints or the possibility for this type of transformation. And my findings demonstrate that this requires buy-in and leadership at every level of the university. So while students are often included in research on campus sexual violence as survivors or as perpetrators, their roles as activists and powerful agents of change are less commonly explored. In fact, my findings suggest that it's not unusual for this labor to be rendered invisible as the university co-opts students' efforts. So for example, students on one campus described how the administration refused to publicly fund their student-run sexual violence support phone line, but were quick to publicly claim it as part of the university's response to sexual violence. At the same time, my research has highlighted the difficult conditions faced by university staff who are hired into anti-violence roles. So it's not uncommon, especially at smaller institutions, for the labor of preventing violence, receiving disclosures, supporting survivors, and coordinating formal complaints processes to be performed by one or two staff members. And my conversations with staff in these positions has highlighted concerns related to precarity, inadequate support, and a lack of recognition of the effective dimensions of this labor. So for example, one anti-violence worker said, we're just a few more breakdowns away from somebody kind of realizing that you can't just have one person doing this work. So with this research that I'm working on right now, I'm trying to surface the work involved in preventing and addressing violence on campus, which I think needs to be understood as a form of caring labor. Conceiving of this work as caring labor not only renders visible its effective dimensions, but also the fact that the burden of this labor is disproportionately borne by survivors and those who are already marginalized within our institutions, and for whom doing this work may involve navigating their own trauma. For example, a Métis woman student activist highlighted the importance of recognizing that, quote, for a lot of people involved in this work, it's their own stories that are on the line, and they're reliving it every day that they do this work, end quote. So this has prompted me to consider the conditions that make this labor so challenging, and the threat and experience of backlash is a significant part of this. So when I began thinking about backlash to anti-violence efforts on campus, my focus was specifically on anti-feminist backlash and its intersections with the alt-right and white nationalism, which have a growing presence on our campus. And for the purposes of today's conversation, this will remain my primary focus, but I want to acknowledge here that the activists and practitioners that I interviewed have described a wide range of experiences that may fall outside of this specific conceptualization of anti-feminist backlash. For example, I heard about intergenerational and ideological tensions among feminists, organized resistance against specific prevention education initiatives, pushback from family, friends, partners, and colleagues for a variety of reasons. And all of these things were part of what activists and practitioners told me they experienced as backlash to their work. And so part of what I've been exploring is the extent to which the concept of backlash can adequately capture the range of resistance that activists and practitioners are experiencing. And I'd be happy to return to this broader question in the Q&A. So of course, as we know, the concept of anti-feminist backlash specifically is not new. While resistance to feminism and misogyny are ongoing and persistent, Susan Faludi conceives of anti-feminist backlash as periods of acute resistance that generally correspond to the perception that specific feminist efforts are threatening the status quo. And I would argue that, at least to some extent, what I've been observing conforms to this definition, because it responds, at least in part, to the perception that anti-violence activists and their allies are succeeding in raising public awareness and getting legislation and policies passed and forcing universities to have to grapple with campus sexual violence. And so in its narrowest interpretation, backlash is often associated with the overt misogyny and organized resistance of men's rights activists and other anti-feminist groups. Although they're generally united by a sense of aggrieved entitlement rooted in the perception that feminist gains have eroded white male privilege, there are important ideological differences among these anti-feminist groups, particularly in terms of how they understand their relationship to this privilege. So for example, men's rights activists have taken up a variety of issues, including divorce law, child custody, men's mental health, and domestic violence. And they posit that the suppression of feminism and revalorization of normative constructions of masculinity are the solution to what they conceive of as a crisis of masculinity. By contrast, involuntary celibates, commonly known as incels, are more concerned with the violent retribution than with the recuperation of traditional masculine norms. Although incels often identify with subordinated beta masculinities and strategically distance themselves from dominant alpha masculinities, which they associate with sexual success, they simultaneously maintain hierarchies of power through their violence. And so while these groups are part of what is generally described as the manosphere, I think it's a mistake to think that they're only active online. Anti-feminist backlash, of course, intersects with white supremacy, heteronormativity, and other systems of oppression. And the entitlement to power and sex that is part of this is typically framed as emerging from normative constructions of white masculinity specifically. So we see, for example, racism being rampant within these online communities. And based on my preliminary research, which I'll dig into a little bit in this presentation, I suspect that there's some significant overlap in membership among anti-feminist, white nationalist, and free speech student groups. Of course, these intersections also shape the impact of this backlash, as the concept of misogynoir so clearly illustrates in relation to the specific racist and misogynist backlash that Black women experience, for example. And so as such, I think it's really important to point out that backlash must also be studied with an intersectional analysis. So some of the examples of backlash that I'll discuss today certainly align with this organized, overtly misogynist public resistance. However, this understanding of backlash is too narrow to make sense of the resistance that is more insidious, but still has the effect of containing, undermining, or reversing feminist advances and preserving the status quo. So for example, Michael Messner describes a neoliberal version of anti-feminism that maintains male privilege by, quote, skirting analysis of structural inequalities in favor of a common sense celebration of individual choice for men and women, end quote. So this version of anti-feminism tends to be masked in depoliticized equality rhetoric and has significant potential to influence policy. As Sarah Benet-Weiser points out, because the legacy of patriarchy legitimates misogynistic arguments as common sense, they can be converted into policy and legal discourse with terrible efficiency. And so I argue that it's important to recognize these less overt forms of anti-feminism as backlash because it's useful in understanding how it operates at both individual and institutional levels. And I think it also challenges the idea that anti-feminist backlash is some kind of fringe concern that can just be dismissed. So as the examples that I'll turn to now illustrate, backlash is pervasive on our campuses and has a significant impact on activist practitioners and their anti-violence work. And you see here, students at UBC have been creating their own timeline of incidents of hate of all kinds on their campus. And this is just an image of that timeline. Okay, so some of the examples of backlash that activists and practitioners described are overt instances of anti-feminism that are clearly linked to a sense of aggrieved entitlement. So this includes the harassment, threats of violence and of sexual violence, doxing, hacking that they experience, especially when they attain a certain degree of visibility, whether on their own campuses or publicly through media coverage, for example. So as one student activist explained, backlash comes from so many different places, especially once you reach a particular level of being a public figure and you become a symbol and not a person. She said, so I think you kind of have your humanity stripped from you. On the other hand, she noted that being a public figure took away from the power of anti-feminists to expose her identity. So she said, their MO is to try to humiliate people, especially survivors who don't want to be known in the public sphere. And that's what they try to do. So they didn't really have much on me. While this backlash often takes place online or on social media, it has also escalated into physical violence and threatening behavior. So for example, one activist experienced coordinated attacks on social media, as well as men's rights activists showing up to intimidate her and her supporters and applying for intervener status during the criminal trial of the man who sexually assaulted her. These are not isolated incidents. So in fall 2019, for example, an instructor at the University of British Columbia, Marina Adshade, reported receiving threats of sexual violence after she tweeted allegations that several female students were drugged at a fraternity party and questioned whether fraternities should be permitted on campus. Prof. Lise Gotel, pictured here on the slide in this poster, this poster was created by Men's Rights Edmonton to label her as a bigot and to sort of humiliate her after she publicly critiqued a counter campaign that they launched in response to the Don't Be That Girl anti-rape campaign. In 2014, a student activist involved in opposing an event held by the Men's Issues Awareness Society at Queen's was threatened and then violently attacked outside her home. At U Ottawa, a student journalist who exposed the misogyny of the Science Students Association's pub crawl received racist and Islamophobic threats of sexual violence and murder. So while these examples of harassment are targeted towards specific individuals, I would argue that the impact of this backlash needs to be understood as an attempt to silence and intimidate activists, but also to discourage others from becoming involved in anti-violence efforts. Another relatively overt example of backlash is the notion that the prevalence of campus sexual violence is overstated and that activism and heightened attention to the issue constitute a moral panic, which, according to Sarah Ahmed, allows a critique of power to be reframed and dismissed as an imposition of moral norms. Related to this notion is the argument that feminists have created an environment that encourages false reporting. So anti-feminist groups have strategically mobilized this argument to attract male students as new members by capitalizing on their fears of being falsely accused. So for example, as I just mentioned, in 2013, Men's Rights Edmonton launched the Don't Be That Girl campaign in response to the Don't Be That Guy anti-rape campaign, which was popular on campuses across Canada at the time. And the counter campaign featured posters such as the one pictured on this slide, which undermine the credibility of sexual assault allegations. This discourse is also visible in anti-feminist threats posted online in September 2015, which encouraged readers to commit a mass shooting in women's studies classrooms at the University of Toronto when a feminist, quote, tries to ruin your life with false sex rape allegations, end quote. And so the claim that contemporary anti-violence efforts have gone too far is also linked to this discourse that's very familiar, the men as the true victims discourse, which can be seen in recent so-called anti-male bias litigation related to Title IX legislation in the United States and the implementation of Title IX on campuses. It also manifests in the form of accused men's defamation lawsuits, which in some instances have been filed against students simply for following their university's sexual violence reporting processes. So this has been happening on both sides of the border. In Canada, author and former UBC prof. Stephen Galloway is currently suing a former student who accused him of sexual assault and over 20 others who are alleged to have repeated the accusations. In 2020, a McGill student filed a $1.5 million lawsuit against the school, the McGill Daily newspaper, and 2 student associations, as well as the student who reported that he sexually assaulted her. In some instances, these lawsuits do highlight legitimate flaws in contemporary university reporting processes, but they also have the potential to dissuade survivors from coming forward. Anti-feminist backlash manifests in the argument that free speech is under threat on Canadian campuses. This argument is premised on the notion that in an era of so-called political correctness, controversial perspectives, particularly far-right perspectives, are being censored by feminists and so-called social justice warriors. So we see this discourse mobilized by alt-right figures such as former University of Toronto Professor Jordan Peterson, who's publicly referred to women's studies and other arts and social sciences programs as indoctrination cults that are invested in producing what he calls the next generation of pathetic, whining radicals. So this discourse has also been accompanied by the emergence of student free speech clubs on campus, which often frame their mission in politically neutral terms, but are quickly betrayed by the fact that they almost invariably choose to defend misogynist, white supremacist, and transphobic speech. So for example, the Students in Support of Free Speech group at U of T held a rally in support of the white nationalist Proud Boys there in 2017. While this opposition is certainly broader than campus sexual violence, there is an important overlap, I think. For example, one of the activists that I interviewed said that a university staff member accused her of infringing on the free speech of the other students living in her residence, quote, because we didn't consult every single student before putting up posters that said like rape is bad and like the university shouldn't support rapists, end quote. By contrast, resident staff failed to take action when men living in the building rearranged the words on one of the posters she had on her door to make it a pro-rape message, and later smashed rotting fruit in her door, which she understood to be an intimidation tactic. The Free Speech Club at the University of British Columbia has been actively engaged in men's rights, and we see a couple of photos of their actions here on this slide. They've led protests against the Student Union's Sexual Assault Center and in particular their Healthier Masculinities program. They've also been involved in misogynistic activity on campus, such as placing a large blue male symbol on the engineering can on the day before the annual memorial for the Montreal Massacre. And they filed a lawsuit against the university after they were forced to cancel an event featuring Andy Ngo, who's an alt-right speaker. Similarly, in 2016, the Men's Issues Awareness Society at Ryerson filed a joint lawsuit with 2 anti-abortion groups against the student union for allegedly discriminating against their right to free speech after they were denied official student group status. So interestingly, both of these lawsuits have been supported by external groups. In the Ryerson case was the Canadian Association for Equality, which is a well-known men's rights group. And in the case of UBC, it was the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, which publishes an annual Campus Freedom Index and publicly claims that equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives constitute a threat to free speech. So while the Ryerson lawsuit was dismissed in early 2018, the Men's Issues Awareness Society founder invoked the notion of free speech being under threat when he said that the verdict would not succeed in, quote, silencing men. He warned that, quote, it's going to create even more people who are willing to fight for these causes, and they're going to be even angrier than I am, so be prepared, end quote. If these groups were actually concerned with free speech, perhaps I would suggest their attention would be better directed toward the use of NDAs and other silencing tactics in campus sexual violence cases. So this free speech example illustrates Messner's neoliberal version of anti-feminism, which tends to be masked in depoliticized rhetoric of individual rights, choice, and equality, and thus has significant potential to influence policy. For example, Ontario Premier Doug Ford quietly passed legislation shortly after taking office that requires all post-secondary institutions in Ontario to implement free speech policies or risk defunding, which simultaneously appeased his far-right constituents and lends further legitimacy to the claim that free speech is indeed under threat on campuses. Last year, François Legault threatened to do the same thing in Quebec in response to activist responses to anti-Black racism on campus. This is also evident in the way that debates about due process and the rights of accused students, which are very legitimate concerns, have been co-opted to advance anti-feminist interests. So in the US, for example, former Education Secretary Betsy DeVos invited MRA groups, including National Coalition for Men, who've been accused of doxing survivors and of promoting misogynistic violence, to represent the rights of accused students in a summit on campus sexual violence in 2017. Following the summit, the Trump administration introduced new Title IX regulations that, among other things, encouraged post-secondary institutions to adopt the higher clear and convincing standard of evidence and guaranteed the rights of accused students to cross-examine their accusers. So the anti-violence activists and practitioners who spoke with me also described forms of resistance within their institutions. And some of these examples are more easily identifiable as backlash, like the case of Clea Schmidt, an education professor at the University of Manitoba, who went public about facing increasing pressure to resign after she critiqued the university administration's handling of sexual violence cases, including her own complaint of sexual harassment against a colleague, which was substantiated by the university. By drawing attention to the issue of campus sexual violence, Schmid might be described, to use Sarah Ahmed's term, as an institutional killjoy who poses a problem because she keeps exposing a problem. Meanwhile, high-profile faculty members may be protected from sexual assault allegations based on the perceived value to the university. So as Allison Phipps explains, quote, the patriarchal impulse to shield privileged men is intensified by the fact that the reputation of the perpetrator operates as a proxy for that of the university, end quote. Similarly, a student activist described feeling betrayed by her institution's response to her efforts to make things better for those who experience sexual violence on campus. And so this is what's reflected in the quote here on the slide. While her intention was to help, her relationship with the administration quickly became adversarial, and she was quickly disabused of the idea that the university would change the way they were responding to these complaints if they simply knew better and knew the impact that it was having on students who came forward. Other examples include more insidious incidents of backlash, like stonewalling tactics that student activists encountered, which included being buried in paperwork, given the wrong meeting dates and times. And feminist faculty described being shut out of their institution's sexual violence policy-making processes. So for example, we see this quote about the university seeing feminists on campus not necessarily as allies, but more as people that they have to keep away. Members of one of these policymaking committees discussed how racialized women were silenced by the white male administrator who was chairing that particular committee. And a student activist described spending 2 exhausting years jumping through administrative hoops to get approval to launch a peer support service for sexual assault survivors, which they'd already secured funding for through donations. And so while these forms of resistance may not be overtly anti-feminist, they have the effect of containing, undermining, or reversing feminist advances and preserving the institutional arrangements, power arrangements that produce and sustain violence. So are these forms of institutional backlash, or are they just business as usual? At the end of the day, what we call these varied forms of resistance might matter less than their impact. So the activists and practitioners that I interviewed described feeling afraid, humiliated, and traumatized. And for many, this backlash compounded the emotionally and at times physically exhausting nature of anti-violence work, as I mentioned before, particularly given that it tends to be performed by survivors and by those who are marginalized within the institution. So in some instances, this led them to leave their institutions or the anti-violence work that they had been doing. So for example, the quotes on this slide are from an interview I conducted with a young man who facilitates men's anti-violence efforts at a Canadian university and who faced significant backlash from anti-feminist groups on campus, including protests, threats of legal action, and harassment. He said, if you go on Reddit and you look at my program, you'll find a bunch of people saying stuff about my program and about me. He said he got 60 Facebook messages under a blank profile, talking about how he could never understand real masculinity because he's queer. And he went on to say that it's been a little bit traumatic and he just can't do it anymore. He said, there's a big part of me that feels like such a traitor for that and such a sellout. And I can confirm that he is no longer doing this work in this particular program. Another practitioner described how the threat of backlash made her feel afraid. She said, I've never had death threats, but I'd be lying if I didn't say that I'm sometimes fearful of extreme right-wing men's groups. But she said she doesn't dwell in that space for too long because it would be paralyzing. Others noted that these overt instances of anti-feminism were not the instances of backlash that were most upsetting to them. So for example, the student activist who I mentioned earlier, who became a public figure and received significant threats and harassment from men's rights activists, said, they're just noise to me. Like, they don't really hurt me in any way. Are they scary? Fuck yeah. But that doesn't really keep me up at night because I understand the root of it. She said that for her, it's the backlash from the people that you think are going to support you that's the hardest. And I'm still struggling through that. And like, it's really pushed me from continuing on doing advocacy and sexual violence work. I interviewed another student who was in the process of switching out of her program, which she really loved because she'd experienced what she described as major bullying by her peers after her formal complaint of sexual assault against a classmate was dismissed by the university. She said, I've heard things behind my back like, oh, we don't want to be in a group with her because this happened. I get looks. I'm the girl who cried wolf. These examples illustrate how backlash impacts targeted individuals, but it also shapes anti-violence efforts on campus. So for example, activists and practitioners described approaching prevention efforts and responses in ways that would avoid engendering backlash, such as explicit references to feminism, lest these efforts be perceived as man-bashing. So my research on campus anti-violence efforts focused on men and masculinities found that there's a tendency to try to make these efforts palatable by framing participants as real men, as good men, or as protectors, while those who perpetrate violence are effectively othered. And so, for example, one of the participants that I interviewed said that some versions of bystander intervention are about encouraging men to stand in their hero space with their capes and these poor women who can't do anything for themselves and who need them. Another said, a lot of times bystander becomes this weird power struggle between men over and about women. Like, yeah, I'll do bystander intervention partially to prove my own masculinity and maybe to get laid. So while these approaches may succeed in getting men in the room, and I don't want to discount that, I know that's a very significant challenge, research demonstrates that gender transformative interventions that challenge normative constructions of masculinity are often more effective in changing men's attitudes and behaviors related to gendered violence. And so while this may be effective, as I said, in getting folks in the room, we need to think about whether there's potential to then build on the fact that they're in the room to start to do some of this transformative work around masculinities. So the desire to avoid backlash may also lead to avoiding critical engagement with men and masculinities altogether. For example, despite the fact that cisgender men perpetrate the overwhelming majority of sexual violence, I found that when I did the review as part of my dissertation research, none of Ontario's public universities explicitly named the gender nature of perpetration or its relationship to normative masculinities, even when they did acknowledge the fact that women, trans and non-binary folks experience violence at heightened rates. And so perpetration was never named. As part of the York postdoctoral fellowship that I did, I conducted a scan of the websites of every public Canadian university for content about sexual violence prevention. And at the time, only 5 of them referenced initiatives that focused specifically on men and masculinities. 2 others referenced male allyship opportunities, but it's unclear whether these were simply aimed at volunteer recruitment or whether they're associated with specific prevention programming. So as one practitioner explained, the university may perceive critical masculinities initiatives as ideologically dangerous because they avoid ideologically dangerous that they would like to avoid because you're inviting a lot of backlash, at least from this person's perspective. Instead, the university is incentivized to invest in anti-violence efforts that publicly demonstrate their commitment to student safety while also avoiding backlash by representing sexual violence as a depoliticized interpersonal issue. So as one student I interviewed explained, if the university responses speak to these more political aspects, the administration feels like they're going to get a lot of complaints and there's going to be this whole uproar because there are so many people who are committed to upholding these existing institutional power arrangements. However, when anti-violence efforts shy away from addressing the roots of violence and gendered power relations at their intersections with other systems of privilege and oppression, their potential impact could ultimately be constrained. I don't want to leave us on a bad note, so I want to talk about some strategies that that activists and practitioners have described for resisting backlash, despite the overwhelming fear, humiliation, trauma, and exhaustion that they've experienced as a result. So in particular, one of the things that stuck with me is the importance of collective care. So activists have described the collective care networks that they've been building with other student activists and with allies. So one said, for example, it was very much just you keep going and you shout louder than they are, which worked in some cases, and in some cases it didn't. Also, a lot of just like trying to take care of each other on the back end, like debriefing before and after and making sure those people who are experiencing backlash were okay. Another student activist said that sometimes she does engage with misogynist trolls on Twitter just to fuck with them, and also confronted one of them in person when they ran into each other at a public event. So she said, I went up to her and I was like, you talk a lot of shit on Twitter about me, come say it to my face. And she was visibly shaking, and like that felt really good because she's somebody who has a large following on Twitter. Activists and practitioners also devised ways of responding to the institutional backlash that they faced. For example, the activists who faced those 2 years of resistance from the university administration over the peer support line that they wanted to establish said, oh, we need more information, and requested 1 or 2 things. And we sent them back 80 pages, which was quite satisfying. Another preferred to think optimistically by viewing backlash as a sign of the impact of her anti-violence work. And she said, I'd say that what we're doing is radical because most people would just prefer that we shut up and go away. And so the more that we're showing them that their behavior is unacceptable and won't be tolerated, the more backlash that there is. So I want to end by saying that while the present moment must be characterized as one of significant momentum toward addressing campus sexual violence, it must also be characterized as one of substantial anti-feminist and alt-right backlash at Canadian universities. And the overarching impact of this backlash can make any gains toward preventing or addressing violence on campus feel like a fragile victory. So as one student activist explained, the more backlash you face in a movement, the harder it gets to continue, and the harder it is not to accept even the smallest possible response. However, at a time when university community members who are racialized, Muslim, feminist, queer, or trans are being subjected to harassment and violence, the backlash only increases the urgency of ensuring that responses to sexual violence are intersectional and address its underlying social and structural roots. So thank you very much. I'll leave it there for now, but looking forward to your questions and to discussing with you. I know we have lots of experts in the room, so looking forward to hearing your thoughts.